Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 26 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat from MXDWN.com. That's Mixdown. So glad to see you well. Thanks for joining us. We've got a bunch of stuff to get into and some interesting stuff about what's going on in our little world of entertainment today. First and foremost, and impossible to ignore at this point, the Writers Guild of America is officially on strike. This is the first time since 2007 that the WGA has been on strike, and this has been after a long process of negotiations that has apparently failed between them and the AMPTP. Now, if you're not a super movie TV industry dork, you're going to want to strap in. This gets a little complicated. Effectively, the Writers Guild of America represents writers. AMPTP is negotiating on behalf of the different creators of content, and effectively the attempt to try to reach an agreement had failed. And everyone in the world of writing television and writing movies is effectively on strike as a result of which. This means that anything that was in development that is a part of using union labor from the WGA is effectively paused. This means that if there's a show that you like to watch, like Saturday Night Live, for example, or any of the major late night shows like Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, effectively those shows are halted and are not on the air. This episode coming up of Saturday Night Live is canceled in the wake of the strike. Strikes are the kind of thing where you never really know how long they're going to last or when they're actually going to end. So this could be quite a dry spell, or it could just be resolved really quickly if the parties are able to find an amicable agreement. Now, most critically, internally within the WGA, there was a memorandum issued to their members saying, though we negotiated with intent on making a fair deal, and though your strike vote gave us leverage to make some gains, the studio's responses to our proposals have been wholly insufficient. Given the existential crisis writers are facing, the WGA said in a message sent directly to members just now, we must now exert the maximum leverage possible to get a fair contract by withholding our labor. Members of the negotiating committee, board, and council will be out with you on the picket lines. And then after that, they issued a public-facing statement in which they said that the decision was made following 6 weeks of negotiations with Netflix, Amazon, Apple, Disney, Discovery, Warner, NBC Universal, Paramount, and Sony under the umbrella of the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, the AMPTP that we just mentioned. The WGA negotiating committee began this process intent on making a fair deal, but the studio's responses have been wholly insufficient given the existential crisis writers are facing. They go on to say the company's behaviors have created a gig economy inside a union workforce, and their immovable stance in this negotiation has betrayed a commitment to further devaluing the profession of writing, from the refusal to guarantee any level of weekly employment in episodic television to the creation of a day rate in comedy variety to their stonewalling of free work for screenwriters and on AI for all writers. They have closed the door on their labor force and opened the door to writing as an entirely freelance profession. No such deal could ever be contemplated by this membership. So there's a few key sticking points that this negotiation kind of hinges on. And of course, first and foremost is looking for larger pay for the creators, effectively in terms of what they're looking to get for the writers that get signed on for major TV shows or movie productions. And apparently the rift, as it were, is pretty large. And effectively it's, that's the kind of thing that can make for negotiations like this to get stuck for quite a while. They're looking for an improvement across the board of $429 million per year, and AMPTP's offer is $86 million per year. But they're also looking into some of the other more hot button issues around the world today, including artificial intelligence. We probably talked a little bit on this show, and you've probably heard quite a bit about the rise of ChatGPT and other artificial forms of intelligence that are creating the ability for people to make work, simulate work by other people. There's a slew of stories that came out in just the last week that our music team covered that we're not even going to go into here about how people are finding ways to create covers of songs using Kurt Cobain's voice or other deceased people's voices. So on the topic of AI, the WGA, and this is from them, wanted to regulate the use of artificial intelligence on NBA-covered projects. AI can't write or rewrite literary material, can't be used as source material, and NBA-covered material can't be used to train AI, meaning that you can't feed something into an artificial intelligence and then essentially help it learn how to emulate the character, the person, the voice that you're looking to emulate, or of course, in this case, the written work. And then their response from the studios was a rejection of this proposal, and a counter offer was not literally, but reportedly, annual meetings to discuss advancements in technology. We'll bring you more on this as it unfolds, but most likely this is going to mean that things are going to be ground to a halt. There's a lot of talk about supporting creators, and there's going to be eventually the typical pushback that happens whenever there's a strike, that people want the services that they're used to. We're not going to wade too hip deep into that because that's definitely depends on where you stand, right? It depends. Everyone's going to feel a little bit differently about this. And while everyone certainly deserves to be paid what they are owed to be paid, this is going to be a bit of a hot button one for a while. So we'll keep you posted as further developments play out. And, hopefully all parties can find something amicable that will work for them in terms of a resolution. Elsewhere in the world of movies that are already made, that is, and aren't waiting to be written, the Super Mario Brothers cartoon. So this is a animated adaptation of the famed video game franchise from Nintendo, Super Mario Brothers, is basically sitting pretty in a post-pandemic world, having been number one at the box office for the fourth week in a row. This fourth week, and this isn't exactly the highest record ever, but it's still pretty significant, netted them $40.8 million domestically, which brings their total in America, just domestically in North America, up to $490.9 million, meaning that this particular film has grossed over $1 billion worldwide, which makes it one of the more successful animated pictures ever. And of course, the fifth biggest picture since the pandemic happened, when people have generally not really wanted to go to the box office. So a massive success for all parties involved. Elsewhere, kind of tangentially in the world of video games, Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is one of the big upcoming games coming out just next week, May 12th. And effectively, this is one of the very weird kind of places where apparently, reportedly, according to the site Video Game Chronicle, that effectively various leaks of the game have somehow hit the internet. Now, major video game companies are notoriously very cagey about who even gets to see a game before it's released to the public. And of course, if anybody actually tried to take it and make it publicly available for free, they vigorously legally defend their copyrights and intellectual property. So it's the kind of thing where if you try to be the person to leak such a thing, you're going to get sued into the Stone Age by a massive company with an army of lawyers. And essentially, within this is, unusually insidious, because how does someone have it if it hasn't been sold to anyone? Now, this is a part of the thing that causes immense problems for those of us in the press, because usually when people in the press are trying to do their job, they're some of the only people that ever get things early. Right? They're some of the only people who ever get a chance to work with and experience something, because under the auspices, usually there's embargoes and other complicated stuff like that, but typically under the auspices of, we agree to do coverage on this, timed with release to maximize exposure and promotion of whatever it is. And, here at Mixdown, we've done that for 15, 20 years, where essentially, we've been getting albums by the basketful, whether it was physical copies in the old days or downloads, and essentially, have to keep that guarded safe and secret, and then consider that only internally and distribute only to the people who would effectively, be reviewing it, to make it available only to the people who are there, and nobody else gets to see it or touch it. And there's a comparable mechanism in the world of video games, usually that comes in the form of like download codes and stuff like that. But essentially, as this stacks up, Nintendo is notoriously very cagey about letting anybody play anything. So is Sony in terms of PlayStation. I mean, they're massive companies. They don't entirely need press. We don't have access to Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, for example, as much as we want to, and we work with the people from Nintendo all the time, and they're very nice people, but we don't have it. So how does someone end up having this? And some of the things have pointed to things like, there's a site called Mercari you might not be familiar with. It's kind of like a slightly more visual version of Craigslist. If you ever remember using Craigslist some years ago when it was very popular, kind of like a swap meet kind of thing digitally on the internet, where people sell random stuff they're trying to get rid of at bargain prices, and people sometimes look and find things they're looking for within that environment, that ecosystem. Now, whether it's real, who knows? It might not be, but one particular listing claimed to have the physical ROM, the actual disc copy that would go in the Nintendo Switch. And then there was even one person who got a hold of some formulation of an illegal copy of it and was able to even stream it on this platform, Twitch, that we're coming to you live right now, for about 30 minutes before some form of a copyright infringement request hit them and had their whole channel, taken down in the midst of the process of that. So this is a kind of a bizarre thing, and I'm sure someone is on the other end of this as far as being responsible, and those people are going to get sued massively. And we will certainly not talk about any spoilers. We will certainly not point you into places where you can find such things you shouldn't, because it's not even released. If it's something that's out there that you can buy, you should buy it. It's probably worth it. Nintendo probably spent a fortune making it. Moving on from there, in the world of music and also in other formulations of complicated AI matters, and there is certainly the topic of disease right now. Grimes, who has become kind of its own flashpoint of controversy because of her relationship previously with Elon Musk and many kinds of other complicated things she said. She's an interesting character. She's made some really interesting music, made some really fun stuff over the years, but then also has irritated as many people as have really kind of liked her. And some people have problems with her from a point of entitlement. And look, you're at least for a while together with the richest man on the planet. There's going to be somewhat a level of jealousy in that because most people can't make enough to live, to eat, to survive, right? Grimes has also been someone who's a big proponent of video games, but also is really interested in forward-thinking technology and has basically latched on to this new AI movement and this new kind of world of AI-generated things and has leaned heavily into something that a lot of people are super concerned of, which is if you can emulate someone's voice and then start making music and putting it out, because that would be some measure of the likeness of the person. And even though, a discerning listener would probably be able to tell the difference, it's enough to make people nervous, like, hey, that's my likeness. I have a right to profit on my likeness. Not any random person should be able to use it and create a hit single and, have it be that I don't gain anything by it. So Grimes has kind of leaned in heavily into this. And in the other week, basically had indicated that anybody who makes something using an AI likeness of her voice, she'll do the same thing she does with any collab that she works on, which is she will give 50% royalties on any successfully AI generated song that becomes any measure of a success. She's kind of doubled down on that as well. And she gave a statement at a conference recently. It's called the International Music Summit in Ibiza. And she said, I feel strongly that there's way too much gatekeeping in music. Copyright sucks. Art is a conversation with everyone that's come before us. Intertwining it with the ego is a modern concept. The music industry has been defined by lawyers, and that strangles creativity. She goes on to say, I think everything about copyright is problematic. There's too much top-down control. In the early days of TikTok, there was a lot of weird music going viral, but now the gatekeeping stranglehold means less interesting stuff coming out. So effectively, kind of not so, I guess, very suspiciously timed right after that, she basically announced that she was going to be releasing her own piece of AI supporting, likeness supporting software. And it's called Grimes A1-1 Voice Print. And effectively, it's going to be a service where it'll help train different AIs that are out there how to emulate her voice in the most, I guess, Grimes-y fashion, and then effectively allow it to, take the things created and upload them to streaming services, all for the low, low price of $9.99 per year. And then moving on into sadder news that seems to be becoming a really horrific trend in terms of covering entertainment in general, which is that we had last year brought you the news of drummer D.H. Peligro, who was, I don't want to say the original, but one of the classic members of what many people regard as one of the best punk bands of the early 80s, the Dead Kennedys. And, along with Jello Biafra, East Bay Ray, and Claus Fluoride, was a part of several incredible albums, Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables and Frankenchrist and, In God We Trust Incorporated, just some incredible, really forward-thinking punk music. And, Dead Kennedys are their own kind of story. Jello Biafra and then the remaining musicians of the band have basically long devolved into a series of lawsuits suing each other over so many things. And one side winning on one side winning on the other. And then effectively the Dead Kennedys kind of regrouping as another band and, with a different singer, but then Jello Biafra suing them, claiming that his likeness was being, misrepresented as if he was still in the band. So it's been a big, really ugly thing for a really long time. And then it was reported late last year, going back to October 28th, that D.H. Peligro, the drummer, had tragically passed away. Now, the reporting at the time indicated it was some kind of a fall, maybe combined with some formulation of a heart issue. But unfortunately, and is my sad duty to state at this time, that it has come down to the same thing we saw with Michael K. Williams a while back, and then more recently with Coolio, that the autopsy report has been revealed. And as usual, when it comes to matters like this, it was TMZ that basically had the information coming from the coroner's report, and that it was apparently some kind of combination of heroin laced with fentanyl. So here we are again. Another, sad tragedy of another really brilliant person. We don't know really many more details than that, what kind of a situation it was, if this was some kind of a fluke or if it was something based on some formulation of medication. I can't imagine what it would be, but it's just an awful, awful thing for D.H. Peligro, friends and his and in the band. And then lastly, Before we kind of get on to our story and our ending here, just two kind of notes. One, and really kind of a quick little thing, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame announced its inductees for this year, which is this really a long, elaborate politicking process. Very not unlike what happens when movies are trying to compete for Best Picture and, Oscar nominations each year in the run up from the Academy. But this year's list of inductees, which, by the way, does not include Iron Maiden, as everyone seems to be very interested to point out this year. Very deserving band. They probably should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But it does include Kate Bush, Rage Against the Machine, George Michael, Missy Elliott, Willie Nelson, Sheryl Crow, and the Spinners. And then lastly, before we get into today's story, I just basically wanted to indicate kind of as an update, we talked a little bit about the box office numbers from Super Mario Brothers. And if you read our movie site tomorrow, movies.mxwn.com, and if you see this show next week when we go live next Thursday, effectively, this is going to be something you're going to hear a lot about because I went basically last week, right after this show went off the air, to go see Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 at a press screening from, Marvel had invited us to. And it's amazing. It's wonderful. We've talked a lot on this show too, because our movies team covers a lot in the world of movies, and superhero movies being one of the more regularly popular pieces of that puzzle in the movie business right now. But, we've talked a lot about superhero movies and superhero fatigue, and is it the kind of thing that's waning, and is it kind of like people's interest in the subject matter might be waning, or is just the quality of what's being put out being, not so great? But wow, what a wonderful finale to this little trilogy of films and this weirdo space rock opera thing that James Gunn pioneered. Such a lovely story. It will totally make you cry. There are all kinds of things in there that are super, super sad and super impressive. And I mean, it's one of those things where I thought, for example, Thor Love and Thunder was a good movie, but it felt like maybe a third of the movie wasn't there. Like they had chopped so much out of it to make it so that it would actually fit within time constraints. This is about 2.5 hours, and it feels like not 1 second is wasted. It feels like if Disney as a whole had said to James Gunn, this has to be 2 hours and 1 minute or some crap like that, this movie would have suffered massively. And it is so great. Keep your eyes out for the very first scene. One of the very first scenes in the movie involves a character, Rocket Raccoon, walking around nowhere where the Guardians of the Galaxy now live, and basically listening to a song on Star Lord's Zune. And I had tears in my eye from the first moment. I knew within 5 minutes of the movie it was going to be great. So if you're at all a fan of superhero movies, or if you're a fan of Guardians of the Galaxy, absolutely go see it. It's going to be a massive hit. It's going to be great. I'm sure there's going to be some pretty impressive box office numbers on this, just like there is every time a Guardians of the Galaxy movie has come out. So we'll be telling you more about that in the week to come. And then as we wrap up here, just a little story today. And basically, I wanted to speak on kind of an abstract concept and how it pertains to just about everything that we talk about on this show or on Mixdown in general, which is fundamentals. And it's a kind of thing where, I think a lot of us who are purveyors and enthusiasts, either of music, movies, or video games, any kind of entertainment, there becomes a lot of talk about what something is. Like if it's the world of TV, is it a fantasy show? If it's in the world of music, is it the, thing within music that's really trendy right now? Right? Music, example, has all kinds of different, kind of eras. There was a disco era. There was the big 80s pop era, right? Like there was the late 80s glam kind of rock era, the big hard rock, glam rock kind of stuff. There was the early 90s grunge era. There was the mid 90s kind of like big pop music, and then big beat music. And then there was new metal. And then, of course, kind of coming into that whole garage rock sound, was led into like 10 years of the indie rock evolution, and what indie kind of dominated everything, whatever you want to call what indie rock was, and an evolution of alternative rock and college rock from years before, which then kind of mutated into EDM and then hip hop. So everything kind of comes and goes in cycles. And a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about what the formulation of something is. There was a time in the mid 2000s, in the aughts, as it were, before the 2010s, where there was a lot of thought about how do you make something sound really warm and bright? Like a lot of that classic 70s music that wasn't super hard rock, but was the kind of progenitors of what became college rock and indie rock and alternative rock. And, when it was in the mid 90s, there was new metal was getting big. So how do we get the dirtiest, fuzziest distortion on 7-string guitars? And what I basically wanted to spend a moment talking about, because it's something I think about a lot, is basically what are the fundamentals of making something great. I think a lot of people think a lot in terms of, well, I want to make this kind of thing. And probably the most important thing anybody who's aspiring to make something great should think about are what are the fundamentals of what is that makes that thing great. Because usually it's not the window dressing. Usually it's not the genre. Usually it's not like the flash, the style, the color palette, the fashion. It's usually not those things. If it's the world of music, it's the song. If it's the movie, it's usually the script. Right? We talked a lot about writers being on strike right now, but 9 times out of 10, if the script isn't great, you can have all kinds of flashy shots and all kinds of flashy camera angles and all kinds of expensive actors, but it doesn't really matter, right? If you basically have all of that, it kind of becomes window dressing unless there's a solid story behind it. In the world of video games, it entirely comes down to, is it fun and interactive? Is it alluring? Does it bring you in? Right? And is it essentially something where you want to pick it up and play it again? Now, we'll just focus on the world of music for a second here. Because in the world of music, I always have said to anyone who cares to listen, the time that is best being spent is just trying to make the best possible song you can. The rules are essentially the same, regardless of the genre, right? You can basically be a singer-songwriter. You could be a death metal band. You could be a four-to-the-floor EDM artist. You could basically be, a pop project. But at the end of the day, will someone hear this song and want to come back to it? It doesn't matter if there are distorted guitars on it or electronic beats or, blast beat percussion. It matters if something about it makes people want to come back and hear it again. This is why something as much as, say, for example, as something, off the average beaten path that most people listen to, but like Slayer's Raining Blood. For anybody who's ever even bothered to listen to heavy metal, knows that song. And it's not much of a song in a conventional sense in terms of like singable choruses and verses. It's not a toe tapping thing. I mean, it's a really brutal, crazy song with lots of changeovers, but it's unforgettable. And just that little bit of what it is makes it basically timeless. I mean, Slayer enjoyed a massively successful career where they were essentially able to headline arenas for decades until they hung it up and retired and basically called it quits as a band, behind a handful of songs like that they were able to make songs that were unforgettable in that little notion of what it is. And that's kind of the rules as far as any genre is concerned, right? I'm thinking a lot about recently the band The Swell Season that was a part of Glenn Hansard's kind of extension of the Frames and how that became, the soundtrack to the movie him and his partner in The Swell Season, Marquette Erglova, did, called Once. And how unbelievably timeless some of those songs were. And Glenn Hansard was a great member of the Frames as a lead singer and guitar player in that band. And they did some really phenomenal records that were gaining in popularity. But then the work that came into how hard him and Marquette Erglova worked in terms of making the music that became what was the music for the movie Once. I mean, it's breathtaking. You hear some of those songs like Falling Slowly or, If You Want Me, they basically become a thing where you'll always remember exactly how it felt and exactly how it sounded. And that's really where a lot of the magic comes in. All the rest of it becomes, well, what's the best form and presentation of this and that? And I think that a lot of people spend a lot of time laboring over a contrivance, right? Like, what do they want it to be? What do they think it needs to be? And what do they think it needs to sound like? Rather than just saying, how do we make sure that this is great? And then we can spend whatever time we need to think on the window dressing of it all. People that I've talked to in the past that are aspiring musicians, the example that I always give is the band The Five Satins, which strangely enough came from my home state, Connecticut. And they have that legendary super old song for most young people out there that would possibly watch this called In the Still of the Night. And if you haven't heard that song or you haven't heard a song recently, do yourself a favor and go and listen to that song because it sounds archaic because they recorded it in a basement on one microphone. But it's amazing. And nothing about the lack of production quality or the lack of polish in it hurt anything about it because the song is just so great. And in its own weird way, that very kind of like not so polished approach becomes a little bit in the part of its allure. And that's really where the time and the discipline is. It's one thing to be able to play your instrument well. That's great. You certainly should if you can. But when Kurt Cobain became famous behind Nirvana, it wasn't necessarily because he knew how to make the most polished production or that he was the most technically inclined player. In fact, most of the time he used his limitations and what he couldn't do as part of sonic artifacts in terms of helping him get more better ideas melodically into what he was doing. But it wasn't those things that made him great. He certainly had a kind of a bent for what he thought it should sound like in terms of mixing and mastering. He had a lot of opinions on what, Butch Vig and Andy Wallace did with Nevermind. He liked to joke that he thought it sounded too much like a Motley Crue record. He thought it was too overproduced and too heavy. And that's why when he worked with Steve Albini on In Utero, he went so determinedly kind of like dirtier and more raw and kind of basement tape sounding in terms of what he did. But it wasn't the technicality in it. It was that Kurt Cobain just wrote song after song after song after song after song. What made that guy great was that he knew how to use such a limited palette of elements and how to paint the brightest and most vivid and different of pictures almost every time he stepped up to the plate. Quite famously, it's always been reported that in the run-up to recording Nevermind, he spent the better part of a couple months with Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic writing 2 songs a day, just as a discipline, just as a solid example of get it done, get it done, get it done, get it done. And then think about it. When you go back and listen to Nevermind, which is for, warts and all, or even Cobain's impressions of it, a flawless record. It has 10 or 11 songs on it. So all of that work goes into kind of its own little clash of the champions of, is this the best idea? Does this work? But it's its own kind of muscle memory. Those fundamentals in terms of focusing on just let's try to make something and let's just try to get good at the process of making something, honed that muscle in him and his ability to be able to make those decisions and to be able to create something great more and more as he stepped up to the plate. That's really where the value is in all of these things. And of course, in a world of movies or television, and there's certainly its whole own craft of how do you stage and film something correctly? How do you keep something in focus? And I have the deepest respect for cinematographers in terms of lighting. Lighting is its own master science just to be able to light something correctly. But in the world of movie and television, if you don't have a great story, and then if you don't have great characters, who cares? So much of it doesn't matter if there isn't a basis point of something worthy to be able to sink your teeth into in that respect. Just like if someone was sitting down to play a game, if something about it isn't like wonderfully easy, intuitive, and fun to do, it's not really worth it. And so this is the kind of thing, art and creativity is the best. It should be free and open to all. There shouldn't be a barrier to entry in terms of doing it. But the encouragement, because I think in a capitalistic society, right, one where everybody wants to be cheered for, everyone wants to feel cool, everyone wants to get the award and give the acceptance speech or be on a stage and get cheered for, there isn't enough thought into how do you get into the craft of really understanding how to make things good and put that time in over and over and over again to scrutinize those things. The advantage of the world that we live in, especially with the internet, is that the world's largest repository of stuff is at your fingertips every single day. Research is available. You don't have to fight for it. I mean, for those of us that are north of 40 years old at this point, when we were coming up, you didn't have something to listen to unless you were lucky enough to hear it come on the radio, or you went and you drove somewhere and you found the album. Right now, almost everything that's ever existed, well, at least that was released, as long as it was released, is out there to be heard or consumed or sampled or tried. And that means that there is now 100 years plus of really brilliant people working their ass off to come up with great ideas. There's so much to be learned from that, going all the way back before there was even really a focused music industry in terms of people just trying to do something through oral tradition, trying to find songs that worked, trying to find stories that worked. That's where the time is worth being spent. If you're someone who wants to make a game, if you're someone who wants to be making movies or TV shows, if you're someone who wants to be an artist, a performer, or a band, put everything that you have into that. Sit there, concentrate, focus, discipline yourself not to be so precious about things, because of course it's hard, right? Art is hard, and it takes a lot to basically feel comfortable enough to have the confidence to be able to put something out there and to risk being scrutinized. I get it. It sucks. Never feels good. But rather than being so precious about it, purposely try to break everything, ruin everything, tear it apart. Try to put bad ideas on paper wherever you can. Try to get out all the cobwebs of the limitations in your brain of what is and isn't technically correct. Just put it out there. Build, build, build. Try, fail, fail, fail. Try again. And then little by little, those kinds of wires, those inroad receptors that allow you to understand how to make something truly great, that will become more natural. That's where the time is best spent. Make it its own little contest where the material that's basically being built, written, crafted, recorded, whatever you want to call it, has to prove itself on its own merits. Does it pass the test of the stains of time? When you've heard it 100th time, does it still sound fresh and inviting and cool and exciting? Does it still read interesting and compelling? Is it still surprising? Is it still fun to engage with? That's all for this week is live. This particular week, we're going to be back next week at the regular time. We are at this roughly about 5:30 p.m. Pacific time on Twitch live, and then we post these episodes right after that in the early part of the week that follows on YouTube. If you do not already, please follow us on Twitch. Please subscribe to us here on YouTube. And if you engage with this content, any of the other places we share it, whether that's in YouTube Shorts or in Twitter or in Facebook or Instagram, we thank you very much for enjoying what we do. Got something really fun that's coming really in short order, and we'll basically have more information about that next week. We'll get into that next week, something a little different in the video realm, just like this, and it will be in addition to everything else we're doing. So look forward to that coming up next week. But in the meantime, thanks again so much for joining us. So glad to see you well.